So our first storyteller of the evening is Rafael Carranza with a story about what's it like to grow up in Mexico and the Valley. Rafael?
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I work for the Arizona Republic. I cover the U.S.-Mexico border, and though I have my fair share of experiences and stories pertaining to the border, instead I want to talk to you about what it is about the border that called my attention and why I wanted to become a border reporter. And it's a story that really goes back, many, many years back, even way before I was born. I myself am a Mexican immigrant. And for many decades, the men in my family had immigrated to the United States for part of the year, and they would work in the fields. They were farm workers. And they would come and spend months here in the United States working whatever crop it is that they were working at, and they would be sending money back to our family back in Mexico. So my dad started at a very early age, and he started crossing the border at first illegally. And then in 1986, he got his permanent residency. And that's also the year that I was born. So for the first few years growing up, that just kind of became the reality, where my dad and other men in my family would spend half of the year at times in the United States, and then they would send money back, and then whenever they were done with whatever crop they were harvesting, they would then go back and spend the rest of the time with us in Mexico. That was the case until about I was 7 years old. At that point, my parents decided that economic opportunities and the chance for better life for all of us was better served exclusively in the United States. And so then we moved, and we ended up in Avondale, Arizona in the far West Valley. Back at that time, Avondale was very different from today because it was kind of far from Phoenix. It wasn't all just one urban community. There was fields that separated Phoenix from Avondale, and it was so far away that we even had our own outlet store. And at that time, even to this day, Avondale is a Latino majority city, and growing up there, you really didn't need to speak much English, and that's how my parents thrived and moved forward. And so for me, going to school was where I started to learn English, and I also started to learn what it was like to be an American. And having this environment really allowed me to thrive, because at the same time that I was learning verb conjugations and prepositional phrases in English class, I was also learning how to put the accent marks in Spanish words in the same classroom. So I was really able to find that balance where I was able to cherish my Mexican heritage with my growing sense of identity as an American. And I never realized how unique that environment was until I ended up moving away for college. So when I ended up at Arizona State University at the age of 17, it was a complete culture shock. I mean, I went from a community where I was able to speak English and Spanish very easily, and where I was part of the dominant culture, to an environment where I was the absolute minority. I mean, I could count in my hands the number of students, of Latino students in some of my classes. And it was a really eye-opening experience because there was just a lot that happened at that time. I mean, in college was the very first time where I first experienced racism and prejudice. I remember when I was walking home, there was a student that from his apartment, the balcony of his apartment, yelled at me and told me to go back to Mexico. So then it was just a kind of a big contrast that in such a prized learning environment, it would also be a place for me to learn a lot of things about my life. And as a journalism student, especially in our focus in storytelling and telling other people's stories, I quickly realized that I was very much attracted to these types of stories that were very similar to my upbringing. They were very different from the types of stories that some of my other peers and journalism students were telling. So I kind of made it my mission and my aspiration to continue telling these stories and in my career, be able to bring to light some of the instances, some experiences such as the ones that I grew up in, that many people may not be familiar with. And so in 2009, when I finished school, just by a stroke of luck, my very first job ended up being in the Rio Grande Valley. And if you don't know where that's located, it's in the very southmost tip of Texas, and it's right along the border next to the Gulf of Mexico. And it was a very interesting time to be there, because when I got there in 2009, there was a lot of violence taking place on the Mexican side. There were two cartels that were going at each other's throats. They were in an all-out war, and that pretty much resulted in daily gunfights and beheadings and all these episodes of violence. Throughout all this ordeal, what really struck with me the most was the resiliency of the people who were living in those communities, because despite the hardships, they still had to find a way to carry on with their lives. And even from the relative safety of being on the American side, we still had some episodes where there was some sort of spillover violence, or we still felt some of the effects. But even then, these are communities that have been side by side for generations, and so a lot of these families straddled both sides of the border. And even the ones in the United States, they were not deterred by this violence from seeing their loved ones across the border. For them, the ties of blood were a lot stronger than bloodshed. So that's something that I really missed whenever I ended up leaving in 2012. And I was very, very fortunate that a little less than a year ago, I got the opportunity, now working for the Arizona Republic, to become the reporter for the US-Mexico border, and focusing especially in southern Arizona, because it allowed me to be in that type of environment once again and to share those types of stories. And especially in working in this project that you'll have the chance to read about next week, it exposed me to a lot of different stories, and in particular there's one that stands out, which is two Central American migrants. They're 20 and 21-year-old Nelson and Norlin, and they had endured a lot of hardship for several months just to get to the Mexican side of the border. And now they were there waiting for their chance to cross illegally into the United States in search of better economic opportunities. They were also fleeing violence back home. And at that time when I met them, they were staying at the cemetery. They didn't know where else to go. That's also where they felt the safest, so that's where they would spend their nights. And safety in some of the border communities is a very elusive term. And that's something that I think they found out the hard way, because a couple of days after I met them for the first time, they were kidnapped. And they were able to get away, fortunately. They were able to tell me a bit more about what happened. Because they didn't know where else to go, they just decided to go back to the cemetery and continue sleeping there until the heat subsided so they could try to cross. And during this whole ordeal, I couldn't help but think, and even to this day, kind of put myself in their shoes, and I couldn't help but think of my father, especially because, at their age, when he was 21, he was doing the same thing. He was also trying to make the crossing into the United States. But whereas I had the certainty of knowing what happened to my father, obviously I'm here today, he's here in the US as well, there was no certainty about what was going to happen to Nelson and Norlin once they left that cemetery in Nogales. I think in addition to that, one other big thing that stuck to me was just the great privilege that I have to be a Mexican immigrant that has, that legal document that authorizes me to live in the United States, whereas they don't. But along with, that privilege, there's also that sense of responsibility and a huge opportunity, because as a journalist, I'm able to share not only those stories, but the stories of this community that I feel that a lot of times it either is neglected or just underreported. It's just the things that happen there not necessarily get exposed and how they are around the rest of the country. And so thanks to my job at the Arizona Republic, I'm able to share those types of stories. And thanks to this project that we've been working on for the past 2 weeks, I'm also able to share it with our readers and viewers across the country as well. Thank you.
Rafa, thank you so much for your journalism. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us. When Rafa first started working on this piece, I was so moved by his insights into what it's like to be really flourishing in a totally bicultural environment, and what a gift he had living in Avondale and also with school systems. I love that phrase. I did not give it to him, where he said I learned how to conjugate verbs and where to put my accents. I was like, God, you are a writer. I also appreciate Rafa's point of view. He's one of 37 million people who live here and work here every day as legal immigrants, and we're really grateful that he's welcome to share his point of view and his insights with our journalism, because it really does matter who's making your news. Like when Rafa talked about like having a different point of view of all of his students, his colleagues at ASU in those journalism school classes, I thought, oh my God, yeah, I would have been that girl sitting next to him pitching a story about like what nail polishes are in for fall. Which you'd know if you followed my journalism career. So thank God that there are other people like Rafa sitting next to me in class. Whew.